This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jazdzewski and Ricardo Silvestre.
Hi, this is Liberal Europe, and I am Leszek Jazdzewski. Welcome back, and today we are going to talk about US, democracy, populism, and maybe even Argentina. And I have a very special guest today, Samuel Issacharoff, who is the Reiss Professor of Constitutional Law at the New York University, author of many books, but the most recent, and I must say, really great read, one of the best I had about those issues in the many years, is Democracy Unmoored, Populism and the Corruption of Popular Sovereignty. Samuel Issacharoff, welcome to Liberal Europe.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So let me start with a very straightforward question. Has shutdown impacted you in any way? What is the situation on the ground?
In the US, it has, on a day-to-day basis, it has no impact yet. Most of the essential services of government keep functioning. Most people take this in stride because we've had terrible both polarization of our politics and the fragmentation of political authority, which means that the parties can't really get things done. So this is maybe the third shutdown in the last 5 years. And it goes on for a while. The politicians yell at each other for a while, and generally it gets resolved. The difference this time, though, is it's uncertain what the Trump administration will do as a result. The wild card for everything in American politics right now is uncertainty around Trump's conduct.
Right. So it seems like not a big deal yet, and hopefully it stays this way. But when I wanted to talk to you, it seems like there were troubles on the other fronts, freedom of speech and many other issues regarding the ripple effects of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Has it sort of settled down yet? Because at the moment, it seemed like it might be a sort of like a breakthrough moment for some time. It almost seemed like coming back to 1950s and the Red Scare. What is it? What is the situation right now? Has it sort of discussion moved to like new issues? There is no fear of censorship, or is the situation sort of tightening, and is it more difficult to be openly speaking, against Trump and the right wing?
I think there's no suppression of speech on a day-to-day basis. It's not as if people are afraid of who they speak to or guarded in the conversations they have. We're not living through Poland before 1989. That's not the scenario. And when the Kirk assassination took place, there was this sense of fear here that what if this were our Reichstag fire? What if this were the event that became the pretext for shutting down domestic liberties and for a big mobilization? That didn't seem to happen. And it was interesting that it didn't happen because most American presidents, or I would say all, until this point, when faced with something awful like a public assassination, rise above the moment and try to be the leader of all the people. And the response of this administration was to immediately try to fan the flames, to try to make it as much a partisan event as possible. That didn't seem to take hold. It's not that there's not been efforts. It's not that there are not real transgressions on the speech front, but they take more subtle forms. I think that what I am more concerned about is the indirect attacks on independent media. The administration's defamation actions, its ability to tie up opponents in legal proceedings, the indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, the mobilization of the Justice Department to do investigations. We're not really, I don't think that the main thrust of the clearly repressive tendencies of this administration are old style 20th century jail everybody, suppress speech. It's more the 21st century vision of just wear them down through endless legal proceedings against them. I am very good friends with a leading Polish legal intellectual, Wojciech Sadurski. And during the first peace government, he endured, I think, 5 defamation actions and lawsuits against him, 1 or 2 of them criminal. That's the stuff that wears you down. It's not that they're rounding up members of the opposition party and throwing them in jail. Trump says he wants to do that, but there's very little evidence so far.
So you wrote yourself that populism is democratic governance with weak institutions, and it seemed in the previous Trump under the previous Trump administration that actually U.S. institutions survived, were strong enough to survive Trump. Would you say that this is the case now, or do you think that we could call the U.S. a populist country, not just with populist president? Do you think that perhaps it's a very different thing with the second Trump presidency?
I think the second Trump presidency is quite different in many regards. First, as you say, the institutions are weaker. The collapse of our Congress has been almost complete, and that's the most worrisome. Our political parties are dysfunctional. That's a terrible issue because that's a major constraint on how the political process works. I think that American democracy is much more menaced than it has been, certainly in my lifetime and perhaps ever since the Civil War. But it's still up for grabs. We'll see. There's certainly the second Trump administration came in and tried to consolidate a vision of executive power, which is unbelievably robust, unilateral, and extremely menacing in terms of our structures, the way our government works. One of the differences, though, is that peculiarly, the second Trump administration is more legalistic than the first one was. So the first Trump administration came in and said, we want to ban Muslims from entering the United States just because the president doesn't like them or they're a threat of terrorism or whatever it is. And the court struck down, time and time and time again, his various initiatives. This time, the Trump administration came in and they found bizarre pieces of legislation, some of them very, very old, that gave the president ill-defined emergency powers. And so they've tried to package what they're doing under the guise of this statutory authority. So they claim to be acting with the law behind them. And so, for example, we have a statute on our books from 1798 when we first had what we call the quasi-war with France. And it says basically the French are grabbing our merchant seamen at sea and forcing them into the French Navy. And we're authorizing our ships to resist that. That was the Alien Enemies Act, and they're entitled to act. And in 1798, you couldn't have telecommunications, obviously, between Washington and a ship. So it was an authorization of the president to just give orders to protect the American merchant fleet. That statute is still on our books. And that's what President Trump claims as his authority for the deportations, for the assault on boats on open water or open international waters. And it's a very hard issue. We have another statute that says from 1977 during the Arab oil embargo that says that the president can act with emergency powers if there's a crisis in our energy supply. Well, Trump is using that as a pretext for the tariffs that he's imposing unilaterally. No president has ever done this before. But there's the facade of legality to it, which makes it much harder. The easiest way to respond to that would be for the Congress to say, this is not what we meant in 1798. This is not what we meant in 1977. Unfortunately, our Congress is effectively moribund.
Why is it so? Because the Trump has a very small majority, and yet he seems almost omnipotent. It's unbelievable because in comparison to Biden, to Obama, who could actually abolish filibuster at his first term, which he didn't. Yet he doesn't seem to be that effective. He doesn't introduce that many laws, but he can actually rule. What is the secret? Or is it just a surface, or is it just is he really walking the walk, or just talking the talk?
He's walking it. What's remarkable is that he's doing what presidents have been doing for the last 4 or 5 presidencies, but at a scale that's unimaginable. So it has been very hard for our presidents to govern. And the main reason for that is the breakdown of the political parties, which means that the Congress is 100 people in the Senate, 435 in the House of Representatives, that nobody can coordinate. You have to herd them, and it's very hard to do. You don't control their nomination, you don't control their funding, you can't whip their votes, as we say in the United States. And so it's largely dysfunctional. So every president has been relying more on what are called executive orders than on legislation. And this has been a steady pattern where we see the level of legislation declining over time, and we see the number of executive orders creeping up. And one measure we use is what's done in the first 100 days of a presidency, because that was the big initiative of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, the first 100 days. So we've measured all our presidents by the first 100 days. Roosevelt in the first 100 days got somewhere on the order of 80 pieces of new legislation passed. That was the New Deal. That was an amazing feat. Nobody's done anything like that, and it went down over time. And basically for the last 4 or 5 presidencies, you get, before Trump the second time, you get 10, 12 pieces of new legislation, something like that. We refer to the initial 100 days as the president's honeymoon period, so the Congress is willing to give the new president the benefit of the doubt. And we can also measure the number of executive orders issued in the first 100 days. And Roosevelt issued quite a number, but typically it's 4, 6, 8, maybe 12. In the first 100 days of the second Trump administration, he passed 5 pieces of legislation, only one of which was a real bill. By contrast, he introduced 145 executive orders in the first 100 days. That is more than Biden, Trump 1, Obama, and Bush combined. It's more than twice as many as all of them combined before. So what you had from the day they entered office is a slew of executive orders seemingly grounded in vague pieces of old legislation. This was well prepared, and that's how he's governing. So I think that the short answer to your question is that Congress is not part of his agenda. He has to go to Congress for nominations, and he controls the Senate, and no senator will defy him for fear of being driven out of their seat. And he needs them to pass the budget. Other than that, he can govern by executive decree until the courts say he cannot.
So you touch upon the issue of weaker political parties, and you write about it very interestingly and deeply in Democracy Unmoored. And I wanted to ask you about sort of deeper reasons for the fact that someone like Donald Trump could take over a Republican Party and become a president. What are the reasons that personality like this became possible in U.S. politics?
Well, I think in some ways the question is, why didn't it happen before?
Hmm.
Because in political theory, we've always known that the risk in any democracy is that a demagogue will emerge. Thucydides described this during the Peloponnesian Wars. Hobbes wrote that in a democracy, the orators will rule, meaning the people who can sway the masses with their oratory. And Donald Trump was a television reality show star and somebody who was a figure in our social tabloids and, a sort of a culturally known figure in New York. The question is, why didn't it happen before? And the reason is that for most of our history, we have had, like all stable democracies, relatively well-functioning political parties that nominated, funded candidates, and then demanded of them that they cooperate in the joint endeavor once they're in the legislature. Let me give you an example by comparison. Let's look at Poland. So you have the Tusk coalition, which won the last legislative elections, and they had a promise of, I think it was 100 different things that they were going to get done. And to this date, they've introduced only 5 of them as proposed pieces of legislation. How can you do that? How can you not fulfill the promise? And the answer is that as soon as the election was over, the coalition fell apart. And so you never had an organic political party. One of the difficulties in Poland is that PiS has managed to maintain itself more as a real political party. Now it has opposition to the right, but there weren't real political parties that could organize your politics, and you see it in the difficulties that Donald Tusk has had as president. We have the same thing here. You cannot get the coalition. It took him 2 years to pass a stimulus bill that the party was unified around, that it needed to be done, but then you had a fight between the right and the left in the Democratic Party, and he couldn't get it done. The Republicans have run every year on they want to repeal Obamacare. They want to change the healthcare system. It's not clear what they want in its place, but let's assume that that's what they want to do. They've never introduced a piece of legislation on that because they don't have a coherent party that can say, okay, this is our program. So instead, they leave a party that's a shell, and then you get a popular, charismatic figure who comes in and takes it over. As I say in my book, the same thing almost happened on the Democratic side in 2016, when you had Bernie Sanders, a socialist senator from Vermont, who is not even a member of the Democratic Party, almost win the nomination. So in 2016, you almost had Donald Trump, until very recently not a member of the Republican Party, against Bernie Sanders, still not a member of the Democratic Party. So this is a political breakdown.
So you write about it in your book, but perhaps for our listeners it would be worth explaining. Do you think that the theory of median voter, the capturing of the political center, which was always the sort of the way to win elections and rule, do you think they still apply? Is there still a market for the centrist predictable politics at all?
I don't think so, because if you think in theory, you want to win an election, that means you have to get over 50% of the votes in the constituency. We have single member districts. Your elections are more complicated by proportional representation, but nonetheless, the basic idea is that you got to win 50% and a little bit more in order to rule. How do you do that? Well, everything we know about every country is that the voters are basically aligned on what's called a normal curve. That is, that the extremes are small, the center is where the bulk of the votes are. So you want to position yourself where the votes are. We had a very famous man in the United States named John Dillinger, who his vocation was he robbed banks. And they said, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "Well, that's where the money is." And so politicians are like John Dillinger. They should gravitate to where the money is, where the bulk of the votes are. And that's what the median voter theory says, that at the end of the day, as the election approaches, you're going to try to position yourself in that sweet middle so that you get as many votes as possible. And there's a lot of theory behind it as to why. What tends to happen now is that our parties are very far apart, and the selection of the candidates is not done by the party apparatus anymore, but is done in party caucuses and increasingly in the primary process. And what you get in the primaries in the United States, and unfortunately it's being reproduced inside the party institutions in Europe as well, you get domination by the extreme activists. So that a Republican primary will have turnout of maybe 10% of the voters, maybe less, but they will be the hardcore. And you get the same thing on the Democratic side, except the hardcore is more to the left. And so you get candidates who are so far apart that there's not the ability to gravitate back to the middle, because if not, they're going to be challenged from inside, from their activist groups. And so both parties are beholden to the most extreme form. I mean, you take a place where there's not even the threat of a meaningful second round, like New York City right now. We have a candidate for mayor who's almost certain to win, who is so far to the left of where the bulk of the New York population is, and who has positions which would put him at odds with the entire national political spectrum. And what that means is that New York will elect a very left-wing mayor, and that will be an organizing tool for the right of the Republican Party to counter around the country. So median voter seems like Christmas at your parents' house. It's a nice memory.
Yeah, it would be nice to have. I wanted to ask you about well, there are so many questions I'd like to ask you, but I have to be conscious of the time. But I wanted to ask you about how do you think, do you think should be the right response? Because there are many ways in which perhaps the liberals or the mainstream politics could and should try to respond to populist nationalism. Should it be more like adaptation, or can we consider even like something like a liberal populism, or is it like a contradictory term? Should it be confrontation, but then it becomes very polarizing and it's basically either populist or anti-populist, or perhaps trying redefinition of political landscape? Do you see any way out?
I do see ways out, but I don't know what the shape of it will be. So let me answer in two parts. The first is, I think the best way out would be to have stable political parties. Unfortunately, no democracy has those right now, and so we're in a period of reorganization. For me, I grew up in the period of the Cold War and the post-war world order of the late 20th century. When you tell me that you have French elections without Gaullists or socialists, when you tell me that Labour and Tories combined in Britain are polling less than the Independent Party, this is a world that's inconceivable to me. When you tell me that the AfD is probably the largest vote getter in the next round of elections, this is a world that is completely alien to me. And when you tell me that the most effective head of government right now in Europe is probably a prime minister who comes out of the direct succession of the fascist party of Mussolini, and yet has learned how to govern. And so we're in a period of realignment, and that's clear. And so the institutional form is really up for grabs. And in part, we have social media, we have ways of raising money on the internet that bypass traditional channels. All these things are disruptive. But I want to go to the other side of this. Why populist nationalism? And I think that a significant reason is that the traditional parties failed because they didn't address what voters are concerned about. So that the European parties were afraid to take up the question of immigration, which is the the signal issue for the populace. In the United States, the Biden administration allowed 2 million people to come unchecked across the southern border in a very short period of time, and responded by trying to give social services and all that, which obviously would have the effect of drawing even more people. Trump ran against that, and he touched a popular chord. The populists are also agitating over the economic insecurity that befalls many of the working classes of the democratic countries. There has been failure, so that, the social democratic left, or the Democratic Party in the United States, has been too obsessed with cultural issues, has been too obsessed with questions that don't seem to get at the way ordinary people live their lives. And the conservative parties have become, the Christian Democratic parties have become too beholden to large economic actors, the huge companies, the dominant economic players. And as a result, ordinary people in the country feel nobody's listening to me. I have nowhere to go. I don't want to go to be told that, that I have to worry about my language for fear of giving offense. And I don't want to go someplace where the only question is, how do we attract more big capital? Tell me about my life. And I think that until the centrist parties, whatever they are, the center of politics, however it reconstitutes itself, addresses those issues, we're giving the populace the terrain.
You describe, I think, very importantly, that also recognizing the people's fears, and basically there's also the question of the status. You quote Richard Hofstadter, which I think is the status anxiety. I think this is also very, very central to this discussion. To end, I wanted to sort of come back to the beginning of your book, where you describe very colorfully your visit to Buenos Aires. You were born in Argentina. When you're sitting in a porteño, waiting for the meal, watching football, you basically sort of start thinking about caudillos, Kirchner family, the whole Peronist movement, and the way they sort of take over. I wanted to, it is basically for our listeners, give them a taste that reading about politics could be actually very colorful and very interesting. But I want to ask you, and to end our conversation on Argentina, where do you see the Javier Milei rule and Argentina, not just economy but also political system today?
It's unclear. Argentina 100 years ago was one of the 5 wealthiest countries in the world. And you walk around Buenos Aires today and you see what was built 100 years ago. It's beautiful, it's magnificent. And it's been steadily downhill for 100 years. And during World War II, Argentina was neutral and did spectacularly well economically. But that's also when the Argentine version of the populists, the Peronists, took hold. And their idea was to make everybody as much dependent upon the state as possible, and to choke domestic enterprise as much as they could. The result was an improvement in the standard of living of people. There was health care provided, there were subsidies provided. You saw this in Poland with peace and the premiums that they were able to give that were very important to securing support, real support in the population. The problem is you have to be able to afford it. And Argentina never could afford it at the level that the Peronists promised. And so they printed money. And I lived in Argentina. The last time I lived there was in 1984. The inflation was 1,200% a year. You lived day to day watching your money devalue. And so everybody's lives was turned into a scheme. And Milei came in, and his opposition was the finance minister of the last Peronist government, who had managed to drive inflation up to 150% a year. You can't vote for that. That's the death of a country. It saps the moral soul of a population to be every day fixated on economic security at just the level of what do I do with the few pesos I have in my pocket? I have to spend them as fast as possible because tomorrow they'll be worthless. It's a horrible condition. So Milei broke the back of inflation. Unfortunately, Milei has not a single democratic impulse in him. He has the temperament of an autocrat, somewhat moderated by the fact that he's an intellectual, that he's an economist, he's somebody who thinks in broader terms. He's not like Trump in that regard. So I don't know what's going to happen there. He has never built a political party. He has no support in the Congress, but he had the advantage that the Congress fractured because the political parties in Argentina are in even worse shape than they are in the United States or in Poland. And so it's up for grabs right now. But if he can stabilize the economy, people will give him such a benefit of the doubt because it seems ludicrous to even have to say it. But when people's day-to-day economic security is up for grabs and they have this sense that nothing is working in this country, they reach for demagogues. And that's what we're seeing around the world with these populists rising. And the fear is because we still have the memory of Europe in the 20th century, the fear is that the populists will be the pathway to much worse forms of oppressive regimes.
Well, I think this is a good place to end. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do read Democracy Unmoored, or Fragile Democracies for both. Samuel Issacharoff, thank you so much for being with us today at the Liberte.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That's all for today from me. Please tune in for Ricardo Silvestre next week. Until 2 weeks. Goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.